Hello and welcome to the Dailies. Today we focus on the single event dominating global headlines, the overthrow and arrest of Nicolas Maduro by US forces over the weekend. Media coverage has diverged sharply across regions. In the United States, outlets have emphasized the operation's speed and strategic impact, while much of Latin America and European press has framed it as a dangerous breach of sovereignty and international law. Elsewhere, coverage has centered on the geopolitical fallout from energy markets to fear of a new era of US interventionism. We'll start with Latin American media, which showed deep splits over the US military capture of Nicolas Maduro. Reflecting regional political divides, left-leaning outlets in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico and Chile condemned the US action as a violation of sovereignty and international law, urging diplomacy and caution. By contrast, right-leaning media and leaders in Argentina, parts of Chile and Peru welcomed the move as a blow against authoritarianism. Cuban media and state outlets strongly denounced the operation as state terrorism, underscoring anxieties about US interventions and regional stability. El País reviewed the reactions, saying Latin American outlets reacted sharply to the US operation, exposing deep regional divides. The report explains that Brazil took a leading role by condemning the US attack and recognizing Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as Venezuela's interim leader, stressing respect for sovereignty and also international law. It goes on to say that left-leaning governments in Mexico, Colombia and Chile echoed calls for dialogue and UN involvement. In contrast, right-leaning leaders in Argentina, Ecuador and Panama welcomed the move, hailing it as a blow to authoritarianism. The piece highlights a region split between fears of foreign intervention and hopes for political change. American media, on the other hand, covered the story with a strong focus on the dramatic US military operation and its legal and geopolitical implications. Coverage also highlighted the split reaction across Latin America, often framing it as a test of US power and Trump's hardline foreign policy. Many outlets also raised questions about international law, regional stability and the risk of escalation, while noting celebrations among parts of the Venezuelan diaspora. The New York Times argues that the capture of Nicolas Maduro marks a clear statement of Donald Trump's ambition to reassert US dominance across the Americas. The piece indeed shows how the Venezuela operation went beyond regime change, signaling a broader doctrine of control through force, pressure and rewards. It also highlights a region already uneasy with Trump's interventions, now further polarized and constrained as Washington reclaims its role as the central power shaping Latin America's political and strategic future. The New York Times also examined how President Trump's decision to remove Venezuela's leader has exposed fresh cracks inside the MAGA movement. The piece explains that while many Republicans hail the operation as decisive and strategic, others question how regime change fits Trump's long-standing promise to avoid foreign wars. It spotlights conflicting messages from the White House, which deepen unease among isolationist supporters. The analysis frames Venezuela as a political test case, revealing how America First remains elastic and increasingly contested when military power is used abroad. Axios reviewed the Democrats' furious response to President Trump's surprise strike on Venezuela and the capture of Nicolas Maduro. The report highlights anger over Congress being sidelined, demands for briefings, and sharp rhetoric branding the plan to run Venezuela unconstitutional and also reckless. The piece contrasts calls for impeachment as well and war powers limits with Republican praise for decisive action, while noting also bipartisan unease. Overall, it frames the episode as a flashpoint deepening partisan tensions and testing congressional checks on presidential use of force. Axios also profiled Delcy Rodriguez, Venezuela's vice president turned de facto leader after Nicolas Maduro's capture. The report explains that although President Trump claims she is cooperating with the U.S. demands, Rodriguez has publicly rejected American control and denounced the operation as colonialism. The profile also mentions her history as a longtime Chavista power broker and current oil minister, explaining how she has risen through key government roles and remains closely tied to Maduro's inner circle. The piece concludes that her defiant rhetoric, uncertain location, and also contested legitimacy underscore doubts about Venezuela's political transition. The Washington Post examines the deep uncertainty facing Venezuela after the removal of Nicolas Maduro. The editorial stresses how fragile and unclear the path forward remains, despite Trump tasking Marco Rubio with overseeing Venezuela's transition. Now, the article highlights also doubts over cooperation from Delcy Rodriguez, the continued power of hardline figures, and the uncertain role of opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. The editorial ultimately argues that U.S. credibility hinges on prioritizing Venezuelan democracy and economic freedom, not simply control or oil interests. Walter Russell Mead wrote in the Wall Street Journal asking whether Trump's resolve in Venezuela will hold up. The author argues that President Trump's capture of Nicolas Maduro shows decisive force, but warns that the real test lies ahead. He praises the operation's speed and shock value, yet cautions that post-Maduro Venezuela could become a costly trap. He stresses that rivals like China, Russia, and also Cuba will seek to undermine U.S. efforts through proxy pressure and instability. The article concludes that Trump's resolve, planning, and domestic support will determine whether the intervention becomes a success or a long-term liability. Ankush Karduri wrote in Political magazine arguing that Donald Trump's seizure of Venezuela's president marks a dangerous break from legal and political norms. The author says that the operation bypassed Congress, ignored international law, and lacked a clear plan for Venezuela's future. He explains that unlike past U.S. interventions, this move only relies on unilateral presidential power, emboldened by weak oversight from Congress and also the courts. The piece warns that this precedent could invite further reckless interventions and deepen global instability unless domestic checks are restored. Foreign policy argues that Trump's seizure of Venezuela's president sets a dangerous global precedent. The analysis highlights how Trump claimed the right to overthrow a foreign leader and also run the country, weakening an already fragile international norms as he acts without congressional or even UN approval. The piece warns that Russia and China could indeed copy this logic in Ukraine or in Taiwan. It contends that the intervention achieves little on drugs, risks long occupations justified by oil wealth, alarms allies, and revives a history of failed U.S. interventions in Latin America. Newsweek examined how Maduro's capture and Trump's vow to run Venezuela affect oil markets. The piece quotes analysts and also experts who say years of neglect, sanctions, and corruption mean production cannot rise quickly despite Venezuela's vast reserves. It explains how current output is about 1 million barrels a day, which is far below capacity. It also highlights what analysts argue, that rebuilding infrastructure could take billions of dollars and many years, limiting short-term price impact. The Washington Times detailed how a months-long, highly secretive U.S. intelligence and military operation led to the 90-minute capture of Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro in Caracas. The report recounts how CIA operatives tracked his daily movement while Delta forces rehearsed on a replica compound. It also adds that more than 150 aircrafts, drones and warships disabled defenses, plunged the city into darkness and inserted commandos. The piece highlights also American military coordination, surveillance and overwhelming force capability. In Europe, the media framed the Maduro arrest with deep unease, stressing breaches of international law, fears of regional spillover, and skepticism towards U.S. unilateral force. Coverage also linked the episode to broader anxieties about Trump-era assertiveness, including renewed criticism of Washington's rhetoric towards Greenland, which Nordic and EU outlets cited as another example of disregard for sovereignty. But overall, Europe contrasted U.S. hard power with its own preference for diplomacy and multilateralism. The Guardian recounts how European leaders reacted uneasily to the U.S. attack on Venezuela, welcoming Nicolas Maduro's removal while struggling to defend international law. The analysis goes on to say that many leaders backed a democratic transition and also stressed they never recognized Maduro's legitimacy, but balked at Donald Trump's claim that the U.S. will run Venezuela and control its oil. The piece highlights how allies split between muted support, legal caution, and open criticism, reflecting fears of angering Washington and also anxiety that a rules-based global order is giving way to power politics. The Times argues that President Trump's seizure of Venezuela's president risks becoming power without purpose. The editorial acknowledges Maduro's electoral fraud, economic misrule, and loss of legitimacy. Yet it warns that abducting him without a clear democratic plan undermines U.S. credibility. The piece criticizes Trump's focus on running Venezuela and also exploiting oil, as well as his sidelining of the Democratic opposition. It concludes that lasting U.S. influence in Latin America depends on supporting constitutional democracy, not coercion alone. The Telegraph argues that Donald Trump's takeover of Venezuela has turned the country into a strategic energy weapon against China. It says Beijing is the biggest loser, having relied on discounted Venezuelan heavy crude and invested billions in its oil sector. The analysis highlights how Trump could weaken Chinese influence, secure vital heavy crude for American refineries, lower global oil prices, and strengthen U.S. economic and geopolitical leverage, all by opening Venezuela to U.S. oil majors, though major investment and also time would be required. And we'll end with Le Monde, which examines how Donald Trump's capture of Maduro exposed sharp divisions in French politics. The piece explains how the left unanimously condemned the U.S. action as illegal and also imperialist. But Jean-Luc Mélenchon avoided criticizing Maduro himself, calling for his return. But on the far right, the piece spotlights Marine Le Pen's position as she warned against abandoning national sovereignty without directly naming Trump, reflecting her uneasy stance towards Washington. Overall, the piece highlights France's ideological fractures and ambivalence towards U.S. power. That's it from us today. Thanks for watching the Dailies, only on Al Arabiya English.